Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. This is a joint event of Financial Executives chapters. The chapters are FEI Sacramento, FEI Orange County, and FEI Silicon Valley. And for those of you who may not know, FEI is a national organization with chapters all across the country. And there may be other members from other chapters joining us as well. Welcome to Developing New Mental Models. It's converting your life story into professional clarity. Michael Seaver and Kalpashree Gupta will be our speakers for today. My name is Parvinder Kang. I'm the FEI Board President of the Sacramento chapter, and we have FEI members joining us today, sponsors, and other guests here. And we look forward to hearing about this. We did hear from Michael and Kalpa once before in the FEI stage under the FEI Women's Icon, and it was a great event, and we decided to have them back. And next slide, Christine. Wanted to say thank you to our sponsors. The Sacramento sponsors are right here. Give them a few seconds here of highlights. And again, I think I said it earlier, but if you're just joining us, for the sponsors, you may change your name to include your sponsor name and add some logos if you want. And next slide. And these are the Silicon Valley chapter partners. Thank you for joining us, Silicon Valley. And next slide. And these are the Orange County chapter partners. Thank you for joining us, Orange County. And in the chat, Christine is putting in the upcoming events for the chapters. Hopefully you can find the chapters that you want to attend and join us for the upcoming events. And Christine, if you'll go on to the next slide. And this is a national event. It's in May in Tennessee, Nashville. We hope that you can make it. It's open to members. And it's a great event. If you haven't been to a summit, it is a fun event. And again, please look up the links in the chat to register for the events. And next slide. Few housekeeping notes. If you do require CPE credits, please know that you must respond to a minimum of 3 polling questions during the 50-minute session. We will go from 12 to 1 for the actual presentation, and then 1 to 1:30 for networking and Q&A. And then questions for today's presenters should be put into the chat. Michael will be monitoring the chat and answering the questions or bringing them up at the end during Q&A. And if you can keep yourself on mute, or Christine will take care of that for us if needed. Next up will be Jeremy Wakamaya. He is the Programs Committee Chair for the Sacramento chapter. He is going to be introducing our speakers. Jeremy?
Thanks, Barb. I'm excited to introduce our speakers. My name is Jeremy Wakamia. I am the VP of Programs for FEI Sacramento, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Joining us today is Kalpashree Gupta and Michael Seaver. Kalpa is a multi-passionate entrepreneur and influencer who exists to reinforce empowering beliefs and create innovative experiences that encourage lifelong learning, enable self-expression, and connect people for fulfilling lives. Kalpa is the CEO of Connect Group LLC, a consulting company helping people build trust, mitigate risk, and grow. Kalpa helps create internal awareness for high achievers and working parents like herself who have experienced traumas as they climb the corporate ladder and navigate challenging work environments. After 15 years as a corporate executive, working with companies like General Electric, American Express, Zell, Early Warning Systems, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Mayo Clinic, Kalpashree founded Connect Group to help leaders connect, transform lives in relationships, and speak their truth. Her mission is to impact 100 million lives in 10 years. Michael Seaver is an award-winning executive coach, leadership consultant, keynote speaker, and author. He's on a mission to unlock human potential by helping people uncover their purpose and live a more meaningful and authentic life. Michael's newest book, I Know, is a practical guide for awakening what's within and finding work-life integration. After more than 25 years, Michael has led teams and coached global leaders. He's invested thousands of hours in the arena, helping others manage personal and organizational change. Michael has been featured in numerous publications, including Forbes, Accounting Today, Financial Executives International, and Best Companies USA. He is a frequent guest on international podcasts and has served on a variety of boards. Michael holds an MBA from the Thunderbird School of Global Management and even speaks a bit of Mandarin. Please welcome Michael Seaver and Kalpashree Gupta to the Zoom stage.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for that introduction, Parvinder, for all of your help with this, and for everybody attending, the sponsors. It really is a blessing to be with you here today. And as we get some things kind of situated here with the screen to make sure that both Kalpa and I are actually featured, I just want to, again, thank each of you, but also to help Kalpa. Just a couple weeks ago, she actually celebrated a birthday. So, and maybe I'm trying to make her blush intentionally, but just a couple weeks back, she celebrated birthday. So happy birthday to you, Kalpa. And before we get started, I would like to launch one of the 5 polling questions. And so, as Parvinder said, you have to answer at least 3 of the 5 to get CPE. But Christine, you are welcome to launch the first polling question so we can give folks a chance to start their CPE process. And you should see it on your screen now. First polling question is, how many years have you been an FEI member? And there are 5 options. I am not a member, or 1 year, or between 2 and 4 years, or between 5 and 7 years, or more than 8 years. And we're going to give you maybe 30 seconds or so to answer that. And while you're answering, Kalpa, what did you do to celebrate your birthday?
What did I do? So first of all, thank you, everybody, all the sponsors and all the members, and appreciate this platform and you being here. And thank you for that. I can always trust you to say something that I blush, right? And you know by now that I don't blush that often easily. So my husband and my son, they made the entire birthday week very blessing. They just took me out they bought stuff. My son bought a sequel a dress, which is like started with like stars, right? Sequence. So I felt like in my 40s, felt like I wasn't back in my being a teenager, and people, and I think this is a crowd after 40. So I hope you appreciate that, So, and then I took a lot of time. I'm not a big birthday celebrator, so I took a lot of time to just be in tune with myself, and that was it.
Good for you. Yeah, I think it's important. There's so much uncertainty and craziness that's just happening generically across society that it affects each of us in a different way. So it's wonderful to make just a little bit of additional time for ourselves to kind of get back to the basics and remain refocused, right? It really does matter. So you might see the polling results on your screen. We can see about 30% of the folks that are joining us today not members, and we've got about 32% that are members or have been members for more than 8 years. I think that's wonderful. So thank you for taking the time to answer that question. There'll be 4 more coming up. And if you have any comments or questions, please place them in chat, and I'll do my best to monitor that as we're going through and actually having this discussion. So Jeremy gave an awful lot of background about both myself and about Kalpa, so I'm not going to reiterate any of those points. But what I would like to do is begin the time with Kalpa with a pretty important question, I think, and it is, please describe your childhood environment and why you moved to the United States.
Sure. So I grew up in a rural mining town in India, and until I was 16, it was a multi-generational family. Essentially, if you had asked me until a few years ago, I would have told you I had a perfectly loving, normal family. right? And but one of the things that I probably wouldn't share with you is that I was sexually abused since I was 3 or 4 years old up until like late in my life, right? Until early adulthood. And so I grew up with a lot of beliefs and coping mechanisms around being that perfect one, hiding behind achievement until it stopped serving me. And I moved to the US when I was 26, but before moving to the US, I had already been away from the place where I was born for about 10 years in India, like working for higher education as well as my corporate career, right? I started my career with GE in India. So I would say my family was, even though we don't talk about our personal like early childhood experiences as often, but it was no different based on the data that I see on this topic and early childhood, adversities that people go through.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Kalpa. It's having done some work with Kalpa before, Kalpa happens to be, if you've ever done the DISC profile, she happens to be a high D, second I, or if you've ever done Myers-Briggs, she would be basically between an ENFP or an ESTJ. And so when you have these communication preferences and styles that are very extroverted, they're very out there, and then you happen to be raised in this environment where they're not always allowed to be able to really authentically speak your voice, that can be very traumatic, right? Can be very shaping to who we are. So it's important. And I like what you said just a second ago, Kalpa, about you had to hide behind achievement, right? That was an important thing that you said, because many of us on this call probably have in some way had to navigate that ourselves. So when we think about this, Kalpa is in a place that she had these really interesting cultural dynamics in her home. There was this lack of family connection, and it forced her basically to project and or live a false persona, right? Something that was really not authentically her. So when those very early years come, we oftentimes, we get our mental maps of the world, our mental scripts, our mental models. She was kind of given those, and at the time, in those very early years for her, those mental scripts or models were kind of that the world wasn't fair and that there was very little that she could do to actually change it, right? And that's an important point to like really look ourselves in the mirror and say, what might our world have been like at that point in time too, right? And that matters.
Yeah. And Michael, I would add one more thing that I think what shaped me as well in terms of the mental model is I grew up in a multilingual like culture, right? So I spoke Hindi and Bengali in my neighborhood. I went to a Catholic school, so I learned English, but I didn't speak English until I was 16. And literally when I left home, that's where I had to learn my higher studies, like all the books and everything in like English, right? So it's one thing to learn, but I almost say I learned English like baptism by fire, right? So I have that interestingly multicultural lens, but one of the mental models that I used throughout was also that, to survive, you also got to connect with people and reach out and talk, right? So I think it was very much core to who I am and, like in being able to navigate life.
Yeah. Important lesson, right? Because oftentimes the very things that we do not receive in our younger years or teenage years, we learn important lessons from that and then really do a great job of seeking it later in life. And so thank you, Kalpa, for being very clear about that, right? Because being raised in the environment that was, there was a lot of diversity, there was a lot of pain and trauma that came from the abuse. There was a part of you that kind of had to hide behind that false persona. So there were many conflicting ideas about what life was, right, at that phase. And that's an important point to understand about her story or her journey. So Christine, if you wouldn't mind, let's launch polling question number 2. So the question is, and this is for CPE again, how many coaches have you personally contracted with in your career? So think about your own career for a second. Have you not had an executive life career coach or similar, or maybe you've had less than 5, or maybe you've had more than 5? So go ahead and choose your response and click submit on that. And I think, Kalpa, you, as we're waiting for the polls to come back, I think you, at various stages of your life, you've had quite a few coaches that you've leaned on in some capacity.
Oh yeah, I would say I've had, at least in the last decade itself, I've had 5 coaches, and they range from like somebody helping with my childbirths to, my personal, like with you, working for my business, like many transformations. So you name it. we all, how about you, Michael?
There have been many. So thank you for asking. When I look back at my journey, one of the things that has been really, really key, and Kalpa actually mentioned it just a minute ago, was who is it that you surround yourself with who has been through roughly something you desire to go through. And so for me, there were 3 coaches that I had hired early on in my business that I thought were really important. And then I've had a number of energy healers and therapists and folks that have guided me through some pretty difficult circumstances. And I know that I could not have done it without them, right? I think it's really important to honor and respect those people who have gone through something you have not, or who have the skills to be able to walk you step by step through something like that, because it really does matter. And Jeremy just put a question in the chat. So would we count unpaid mentors in this assessment? And that's a great point, Jeremy. So mentors, coaches, consultants, therapists, they all have a little bit of a different bent in terms of how they really genuinely uplift a person. So for our purposes today, they could be included kind of in that bucket. And so I think many of us probably have had those mentors, and that's what I love about FEI all the years that I've been involved in some capacity, is that they do a wonderful job of connecting leaders with other leaders in a really powerful way, right? To really give folks that mentorship and guidance. And here we go. There's the answers to the polling question. So when it comes to coaches, about 45% of us says we have not had a coach yet. And then I think there was about 50% that said less than 5. And so I'm going to close that. And did we lose Kalpa? She's still there?
Michael, I'm back. I think it's thanks to technology.
Okay, as long as you're there. As long as you're there.
I'm simply not spotlighted at the moment.
Okay, no, you're good.
Yeah, there you go.
And so there was just, I don't know if you saw it, Kalpa, but there was, probably 50% or so that had not had a coach yet. And so we're kind of in that place. And so that is important to kind of think about. Now, when we go back to the year 2018, right, it was October 2018 that you and I had met. Would you mind explaining for our attendees today, the circumstances surrounding why you hired me that month, that year?
So I think I had run out of ideas to fix myself, honestly. I think we all learn through, different coping mechanism. And one of mine was to everything out externally that's going wrong, it's my fault in some way or the other. What can I do to give other people the benefit of doubt and simply don't allow that grace to myself. So I had left a corporate job after nearly a decade, and I was a people leader at the time. My son was 3. And I think a lot of the trauma triggers had started showing up, because that's the time when I was that age. I had experienced abuse. So part of me was very protective of my son. But a lot of the times as parents, and many of you might relate that externally, a lot of the things that go on, somehow, if we don't directly resolve those issues with wherever it arises, we direct sometimes to our kids. And I found myself in that situation where I was lashing out at my, 3-year-old, right, who I should be parenting essentially, right? So, that wasn't right. So, and I remember before leaving that job, I had gone to my husband and said, hey, I want to go for therapy. But, I think we were not open to that at the time, essentially. So I pushed the can down the road, and around the time my grandpa, my mom's dad had died, and my parents were visiting us. So it was a very traumatic time. But I remember my dad and my mom, they were there and they were the strength to me, right? So they stood by me that you did the right thing. But I think just the way things had happened, I was working late and I was burnt out, and there were a lot of I would say, even I would use the term gaslighting. This term didn't exist back then. A lot of us are knowing a lot of the biases that exist and how the toll that it takes, especially if somebody who's had gone through trauma. And then the workplace toxicity. There are 2 million people, I think they are impacted by workplace violence or toxicity annually in America. And the deck, you might have, I've sent it, you will see some of the stats. And oftentimes it's not talked about. These could be day-to-day little microaggressions to sheer toxicity, right? So in my case, it was, I remember getting the promotion and one of the leaders telling me, oh, leadership doesn't come naturally to you, right? Or when I decided to leave, it was you can grow here. I want to make sure you know that. So I in some part of me felt like that is okay. But then if I write a case study on some of the experiences and I remove me, right? And I'm a product lead, product person, I like to solve problems, right? So if I treat me as a product and a situation and a case study, in no world that would be considered okay, right? Now, when I look back, Michael, I question myself that, why did I it's not about what others did, but what was going on in my life that I was tolerating that, right? I was tolerating, the undermining, the manipulation, people being moved out and not getting the support that I needed as a leader, right? And it's not about any organization. You take any brand, any organization, and these things happen. There are pockets where things happen. We all have encountered some things, but the question, the point of this session today is to know that be very mindful of, like the what's going on. And when you tolerate certain things, also as leaders, be aware, like, why are we tolerating some things? What are our internal beliefs? What are our mental models, right? And for me, I was really in a victim mindset, right? Even though I wanted to fix myself, but I was in a victim mindset. And I still wanted to kind of fix everybody's problem, right? And eventually I came to the realization working with you, Michael, that, that wasn't my path. That simply wasn't my path. That situation simply taught me to get very clear on what I valued. And, that there was a clearly values mismatch in the situation that I found myself.
Yeah. Yeah, when you think about those early years, those teenage years, possibly even in your early 20s, right, there was this need for you to kind of project or live a false persona. So then you fast forward a decade or maybe 15 years, and all of a sudden it's 2018, 2017, 2016, 2019. So you're in your mid to late 30s, right? So we're kind of moving forward a bit in life. And we're at this place where you'd been with an organization for a while. All of a sudden, a son comes into your life, your paternal grandfather passes away, right? And these things start to happen. And all of a sudden, a lot of those old memories come to the surface. And so the way that I looked at this as I was going through the process of supporting Kalpa was to say, okay, these things happened in those younger years. And now for, let's say, 15, maybe 20 years, she has been living this false persona to her own physical and emotional and career detriment. Right. And that was the thing that I really wanted to make the point for her, was that for the first time possibly in her life, and this was 2018 again, was that she could vulnerably talk through the highs and the lows of the various things that she had been navigating, because there wasn't that safe outlet that existed before. And as we just saw from the polling question, right, there's quite a few folks who hadn't necessarily engaged a coach per se, but maybe they've had mentors and other things. So it seems like it's a relatively common practice to go through a series of events and then be triggered by some sort of external circumstance, but then not necessarily have the ecosystem around you to allow for that really vulnerable discussion. And for whatever reason, the universe brought Kalpa and I together for her healing in that way. But I appreciate what you just said, is that you willingly, intentionally, proactively recognized the victim mindset and said, I'm going to do something different about this. And so Kalpa, her husband, myself, and my partner, Tiffany, are all graduates of the Thunderbird School of Global Management. And so somehow or another, Arnab, her husband, had heard about me and we got connected. And for me, it was fantastic. So let's narrow down in just a little bit, Kalpa, on the actual coaching itself, if you don't mind. Was there something about the coaching itself that really did help to gift you deeper levels of healing?
Michael, I must acknowledge, like I always say, my life is a series of beautiful accidents and people that I meet in my life, right? And you were one of such accidents, which I think there was divine intervention, but my husband, knew you, or rather he probably hadn't even interacted as much personally, but he had heard great things about you and he recommended your name. And I think those of you that know Michael, you probably, know that what a great listener he is, right? So I think that's one of the first, gifts that you gave me, a gift of attention, just listening, no judgment, that judgment-free space. And then you, even before we started working together in a coffee shop, I still remember that place, and you sharing a story of one of the clients with all full confidentiality, saying, hey, sometimes people in their middle of their life, some repressed memories come back, and which is why they struggle in intimacy. And also, they sometimes don't marry, sometimes they won't have kids, or even if they have married. And I don't want to link all the two, but there are all external like manifestations of, some things that happen. And I still wanted to shove it down, like the carpet, right? I thought about it. And even before we started working, then I texted. So Michael, I think that was really beautiful. Like you gave me the gift of permission, of permission to share my story. And two things we worked on. One was aligning my life's mission and direction based on, what brought joy to me, and doing a lot of the assessment around what motivates me. I think that was really foundational. And then the second thing, getting very clear on my values. In fact, these are the value cards, Michael, that you used. I still have that. I use them periodically and to just stay aligned.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that, because it is difficult when we have to be the rock for so many other people in our lives, and we haven't had that vehicle or that outlet to be able to talk through a number of things that have happened for us. And in so few circumstances or instances do we actually take the time to understand what we truly value, what our life's purpose or mission might be, or how can we move forward in a really meaningful way. And there's some great research out of Stanford University and something called the Huberman Lab, which is now showing that the brain releases dopamine in the step-by-step work towards a goal, not in the accomplishment of the goal, right? And so once we were able to kind of figure out what was Kalpa's life's mission, or what were her core values, now we could start to shift behavior in those mental models towards a place of being able to take action on things that were genuinely motivating because they released dopamine into her body. And all of a sudden, we're starting to move forward towards something that really matters. And Kalpa, you had mentioned in the PowerPoint, the ACE study. Would you mind speaking to that just a little bit too?
Sure. So ACE, which is the adverse childhood experiences, are really the single greatest unaddressed public health problem that we have today. And this is not just me saying, this is the former president of American Academy of Pediatricians, Dr. Robert Bloch, saying like for many years. So there was a study back in late 90s by CDC and Kaiser Permanente on around 17,000 American adults, like what you would consider Caucasian, 75% with college degree. And what they found in that is ACEs are very common. And ACEs essentially means either you had abuse, neglect, or family dysfunction in your childhood, right? And there are 10 different criterias. And it's very common, 1 in 8. It's only like, it's only about a third of the people that have had like no ACEs, right? 60% of the people in that study had ACEs. And there was a subsequent study to include not just family dysfunction, but also community, intergenerational trauma, community-based abuse. So for example, bullying, racism, community violence. And what they found is when you account for that in that population, which was a much smaller study, about 1,700 adults, is ACEs, it's only about 16% that didn't have any ACEs. So in the first one, about a third didn't have ACEs, but when you account for all that community-based violence, only a third didn't have anything. And then the proportion of people that had more than 4 ACEs, they were almost 3 times more than the first category, right? So we got to recognize our privilege from that. And these ACEs are not on its own, it's nothing, but they have long-term impact on our brain's wiring and health outcomes. And I highly encourage you to like look up Dr. Nadine's like TED Talk, or there's a book, Deepest Well by her, which goes into length of these, and just be aware that, a lot of the mental illness and many other things that we are, not mental illness, like a lot of the mental health problems that we are seeing are really tied to some of the early adverse childhood experiences we've all had, whether it's divorce or whether it's, some kind of parental separation. And we don't realize, sometimes we shrug things that it's something in the past, and we put on that, happy face and that hat, and who's like there to take care of everybody, but it takes a toll in your life. So know your ACE and make sure that you are aware, to see where some of your coping mechanisms are coming from, and are they serving you? And if they're not, like, time to change some things.
Yeah. Yeah, and Sheridan just made a wonderful point inside the chat that ACEs will come up later in life, and they really do determine the fight, flight, or freeze response. It's a great way to say it, and thank you, Sheridan, for saying that. So in those early years, right, when Kalpa was in India, she was basically forced to live kind of this false persona. So then we get to, mid to late 30s, all of a sudden now there's a number of reverberations that are happening from those ACEs. And so, as she said, there was this beautiful accident that she and I were actually able to meet. And then we really started to dive into not only what were her ACEs and how were they manifesting in her life today in terms of her behavior that wasn't beneficial to her, and then saying, okay, we're going to figure out how to release the emotion associated with the ACE, and now we're going to figure out how to realign where you distribute time day to day. Right. So this is where the beginning of the new mental model is that we don't have to relive the mental model associated with the false persona or the ACE. We're now trying to live the mental model associated with your mission, your purpose, right? Your core values, the things that motivate you. And it just so happens that Kalpa at that time was very motivated by new ideas. She was very, very motivated by having control over her own destiny. And it just so happens that she also had a capacity to thrive in chaos. And so when we started to really kind of plug all of these pieces together, we were able to see that there were patterns in behavior that we could take action on to reformat the mental model. So if I'm not mistaken, in the last couple of days, each of you has received an email with the PowerPoint that Kalpa had created. And if I'm not mistaken, inside that email is a link to be able to take the ACE study for yourself if you desire to. So it's 10 very simple questions. It's just, you just answer them in your mind and you calculate the number of times that you had a particular experience. And when I did it a number of years ago, I had 4 of the 10 ACEs. Mine were really around emotional abandonment. That was a difficult thing for me as a child. How many did you have, Kalpa? How many ACEs did you have?
Well, in this case, I gave everybody grace. I said only 1, but over the years, I think I keep finding, I think it's definitely more than 3, right? But it's mainly around emotional, abandonment and abuse, neglect, essentially, right? So it's those 2.
Yeah, it's important for each of us. And that's the thing, as she mentioned earlier, the idea of not offering judgment of oneself or of anybody else for their emotional response mechanisms today, because more likely than not, they are some sort of a response to an ACE from those younger years.
And Michael, as we are talking about ACEs, I highly recommend a book like The Drama of the Gifted Child. But basically, this is like one of the most beautiful books I have read about just understanding our childhood, right? Like the relationship that we have with our caregivers. And, I think one sentence that stood out was the most efficacious objects for substitute gratification are parents' own children, right? And it's not the abuse as we think it is, but sometimes it's just the emotional neglect. And we just we are always trying to do something, and we almost feel like you're never meeting that standard even later in your life. And how many of us reach that midlife and later in life only to never reach that aspirational goal that somebody else had for you?
Yeah, that's a great way to say it. So regardless of your age or where you're at in your respective journey, it's important to recognize that she came to this agreement for herself in her roughly age 38, right? So she started her healing journey in her late 30s. And as we're, 4 or 5 years later, right, there's still healing occurring. It takes a very long time. It's almost like we climb an upward spiral that is important to kind of recognize that as we're climbing that spiral, we're going to be triggered by similar circumstances at any point in the future, and they're likely connected back to those ACEs. But as we get to that point where Kalpa is in her late 30s, about ready to cross over into her 40s, right? She's now begun the process of shedding the false persona that was given to her in those younger years. And because we knew her mission or her core values, now we're in this place of she's beginning to get that dopamine into her body. She's beginning to feel the motivation because her daily activities are now aligned with things that are really genuinely interesting to her, like her core values. And all of a sudden, I started to see a shift myself, because even though our coaching had stopped after, I think it was a couple of months, we would still talk pretty regularly. And she would begin to talk about how there was actually a purpose inside of the pain, right? There was lessons to be learned inside that. So the way that Kalpa said it was that she could see the lessons learned, the purpose inside the adverse experiences or the pain. And then all of a sudden she was thinking to herself in her early 40s, how do I now pay that forward so that others suffer less? And I really loved when you started to talk about those things, Kalpa, because all of a sudden now we don't look at those childhood adverse experiences as necessarily being overly bad. We have just defined a new mental model for ourselves that says that we're going to give this a neutral or a more positive value, and we can now uplift and help other people with that. Would you agree?
Oh, totally. I think one of I didn't mention that when you asked me earlier, but it just came to me that, one of the things that I started doing right after we worked around that time was service, right? I started reaching out and volunteering for some of the causes, that were in my control. And that is one of the ways I found a lot of the resources on healing, like including the ACEs study. And pretty much I carved out my day, like that my core values are learning, compassion, courage, power. And some things have shifted, like from a belonging. I used to say belonging and autonomy, but it's really more connection, because belonging had a sense of still like something external. So I played with words, right? They have evolved over the years. So it's really more connection, like with me, everybody else. So I think the gift that, as part of that in the mid 30s, late 30s, then I saw some positive effects, changes, Michael, as you were saying, like the next role that I took was I was choosing my boss, right? And I've intentionally done that, but except for one time when I went with a desire for more money and title, just ignoring some things, and that didn't serve me very well on a hindsight, right? So one of the things was also, one of the outcomes was also that I am a risk taker, and I'm an entrepreneur, and I can lead large teams. No wonder I was able to do very well in the corporate lives. But then I was, feeling like I didn't fit the box, right? I was put in a box that I was not. And I'm sure many of you feel that way in our day-to-day, right? So I just didn't have the tools and resources to navigate back then. So after working with you, then slowly as I made those changes, Michael, I think things started shifting.
Yeah, you made a very proactive and intentional choice to do that. And that's oftentimes the hardest part, is to get a person to the point of being willing to leave the comfort of the past behind and to take some sort of a risk into a future that is very unknown and uncertain, right? It's very difficult. But to Kalpa's point, connection is the thing that allows for those risks to be okay, right? I mean, it really does matter. And I say this somewhat jokingly, but it's also true. The best drug for a human is another human, right? If you need to get through something, another human, some sort of connection is the absolute play to get you through that. So I'd like to ask the third polling question, Christine, if you would mind putting that up on the screen. Third polling question for anybody looking for CPE is, in your perspective, right, following your gut or your intuition, what % of the day are you living your core values? And there's 5 options on your screen: 0%, 25%, 50%, 75%, or 100%. No right or wrong answer. Just what % of the day do you think that you are living your core values? And we'll give you about 30 seconds or so to be able to answer that. What do you think, Kalpa? What do you think is going to be said? Do we think it's going to be high, or do we think it's going to be low?
I don't make any guesses, Michael, but we'll see. But, I've been at different points in time in my life, even though in spite of being clear on my values, when I started tracking, I realized I was living less than 25%, or there are days where I did 0. So it's really important to take an overall gut check over time and see, track as well, right?
Yep.
In different ways, but I feel like I don't know I ever lived with 100%. Directionally, yes, but there are days I'm certainly living more aligned, right? But it's not 100% always. But I think the thing here, the point of this question is also, the 100% or 75%, I think these are directional. Am I making life's important decisions with those, my core values aligned, right? I think that's the point. How are we making decision? And in that sense, I believe I'm completely in alignment with my values.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Right. I like the word that you used, which was directional. Okay, so the actual responses via those folks who are attending with us live, about 32% said they spend about 50% of the day living their values. About 50% said we are living our core values 75% of the day. And there's actually a little percentage that said 100%, which was awesome.
Yeah. And Michael, can I make an observation? This is
Please.
like it's like a normal distribution, like any one of the normal, mental models in our life.
For sure. I love that. And thank you for pointing that out. And Mark Green from FEI LA just mentioned in the chat, right? While we're striving for 100%, it is tough to fully live it. We are human, right? And there's oftentimes a random or a malevolent, kind of thing that exists in society. There's just things you just can't predict or control. As many people experienced a couple of weeks ago with the FAA system going down and, the supply chain issues we've experienced in the last couple of years. So there's a lot of randomness and uncertainty that exists that does affect us, right, in our capacity. So thank you all for answering polling question number 3. So for you, Kalpa, number 4 is, how did you feel as you took more action actually aligned with your mission and your values? Like, how did that feel to you?
Sense of relief, I would say. Finally, I started just prioritizing me, if you will, right? And at the time, I obviously took a different role. I wasn't ready to jump full force into, the entrepreneurial path. And then the company did a restructuring, and along with a large number of people, I lost the job. But it didn't take a toll on me, right? I don't carry any I had amazing experiences. Those people, in all my organizations, they've stayed really good supporters over the years. So, and that allowed that role, at the time, to also work on my healing, whether it's top-down therapy, with different people, or then subsequently also working with different coaches, couples therapies, and, others to be able to share finally, the story. So, yeah.
Yeah, it matters. I remember when we were kind of doing the comparison between a couple of options and things that you had in front of you, right? You took one of the options, you got about a 25% jump in pay and compensation. And then it wasn't that long thereafter that all of a sudden there was the restructure inside that particular organization. But I think it was right about that time that you had also started your LLC. Is that correct?
I had already, so this is literally January 29th, around this time, 4 years ago, I created my LLC, right? Which was what's next for Kalpa, and connection, creating connection, with myself and for others, and connecting ideas. So yeah, it's been 4 years.
Yeah, good for you. And congratulations on that. And I see in the chat that Tiffany put a question, and the question is, what physical reality artifacts do you use or create for yourself to support yourself in moving toward your goals or demonstrating your core values? And do you have an answer for that, Kalpa? Because I've got some ideas.
I do. So I have my vision board. I don't know, I can't turn my camera if I do too much, but you can see here, right next here on my board, I literally have my quarters planned out like a product person. Also my key things, my calendar is literally I have daily rituals that are marked on my calendar, from meditation to breathing to exercise, everything. So if it's not there in my calendar, it doesn't exist, right? So that's number one. That's one simple change that I've started doing, and which means I have to sync up everything on my calendar. Which is easier for me than maybe many people in the corporate, because of the security and many other, but things have changed. So yeah, those are 2 things I would say.
That's great.
That I'm doing.
And thank you, Tiffany, for asking.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Thanks.
That's really good, because for a person who may not be living their core values very much right now, I just encourage you to snag a piece of paper, write your core values down the left-hand side. And then on the right side of the page, just brainstorm as many ways as possible that you might live those core values. And so I've helped a number of clients keep a journal day to day about basically what it is that they're doing daily to be able to live the core value. And so if they discover over a 2 or 3 week time frame that they're not living the core value very much, then we need to figure out a way to create those time blocks to be able to make it work. But there's also, I've seen a number of clients. I helped a client in New Jersey a number of years ago that when she traveled the world, she would buy jewelry. And every time that there was something difficult happening at work, she would play with the piece of jewelry, the necklace, the earring, the bracelet, and that was the reminder of her core values. Right. So whether it's a vision board, whether it's a journal, whether it's jewelry, whether it's, a person, you have like an accountability buddy, there's a number of vehicles by which you can make sure that you're staying focused in on living them. It's really what's going to work for you based on your communication style or preferences.
Yeah. And Michael, one of the simplest thing I would also add is like post-it notes. So for me, some of the affirmations around values and things, they are like literally visually there around me all the time, because as leaders, how many times, you've been in a session like this, you're inspired and we have all these ideas, and then we get busy, you go back and then you're questioning yourself, like, even though you do the best. So it's so important to have things like visually in front of you, like just for that constant reinforcement in your life.
Yeah, well said. And it's so as we're kind of looking at Kalpa's late 30s, early 40s, and now we're starting to say for her, the mental scripts and the models and the maps of the world that were given to her in those very early years, you're starting to hear her say that she was prioritizing herself and she was doing a number of things that were replacing those old mental models with actual mental models of the world that were based on her core values, her mission, and a redistribution of time. And what I really appreciated about her at this particular point in life was that all of a sudden her self-worth, it's very, very quickly rising, right? And there was deeper levels of healing. And this is where you're talking about being in service, Kalpa. All of a sudden, the lessons that you learned, you started to pay them forward. So I think there's a connection or a correlation that when you start to live your core values more and you have these new mental models and you're in service of another person who has been through roughly something the same as you've been through, now all of a sudden you really start to feel healed and optimistic and positive in a way you might not have before. Right? That's important.
Yeah.
So Susan just put a comment in the chat, and it's like, well, it's like what they tell you to do in the airplane. You got to make sure you put your own mask on first, and then you can help others. And that's a great metaphor to utilize because so often we get in our society to be in the service of others first, but not know ourselves well enough deeply to really genuinely serve people in a different way or in a more aligned way. So Kalpa, when we look at the folks that are attending today or those that might end up watching this virtually later, what can the financial executives who are joining us do to make the workplace more equitable? Like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I was thinking about this today, right? So, a lot of the things that are happening, like layoffs and, and this is not new, like mature companies, everybody goes through at a certain time, but the way things are happening right now is just bothers me as a human to the core, right? Which is, and not just finance executives, I think a lot of us can do, like, how are we treating people? Like, the people that we are trusting to take care of our customer data. And if I'm looking at some of the brands also that I engage with, and if one person as an employee was like trustworthy up until like they are fired or they are let go, like, how do I make sure, like, are we so insecure that, we are afraid of somebody stealing our data? I'm questioning some of the practices of the brand, and I'm going to be very mindful of how I engage and where I engage. So I think consumers are watching. So as leaders, to the extent as finance executives, and sometimes, people, we all don't have that directly in control, just the way things happen, but urge within your organizations to be a little bit more human when these things happen, because especially if somebody loses an access, right? The next day you're taking away a core part of people's connections, right? So that's number one. Number two, from a get to know other people, right? So share a little bit about you. The trust in creating equitable workplace, trust is the foundation, right? So if you don't know, if people don't know you, they can't like you and they can't trust you. So you find your unique ways of showing up consistently and sharing about you. And number three, like, your actions need to match your words, right? That's how you create trust. I think those are the three, Michael. How are we doing on time?
Yeah, I know that it's getting close to the top of the hour. So we have, I think, one or two more questions and a couple of polling questions. I want to be respectful of that. Yeah. And what I wanted to point out, and thank you for answering that, Kalpa, is that I appreciate that you said that it bothered you to your core, right? Because at a core, we all desire to be connected, but the way that connection happens is through being authentically ourselves first. So as society goes through its transformations and changes, we really want to be a safe place for others to be seen and heard without any type of judgment, right? So when we're healing, the more that we can do that for the folks around us, we're going to be in a really good place. And as we've noticed, at least I've noticed, is that there are many outward differences, physical, material differences that exist between person to person. But deep down in our soul, in our heart, we're pretty much the same, right? We're all humans. We all have kind of the same desires and things that are important. So be really, really not like focused in on the fact that we're far more similar than we are dissimilar. Take some of Kalpa's advice, and we're going to be in a place that we can make the workplace far more equitable. So we've got a fourth polling question, Christine, if you would like to be able to launch that. Fourth polling question is do you feel in your workplace today that you have a high trust working environment? So do you feel you have a high trust working environment within your organization? And there's 5 options there. Number 1 is all of the time. Number 2, most of the time. 3, I'm neutral or not sure. And 4, some of the time, or the last answer, none of the time. So take about 30 seconds or so to be able to respond to that polling question. And we'll see those results pop back up in a second. But if anybody has any questions of Kalpa, don't forget that we're going to do some networking and some further Q&A after 1 o'clock Pacific time. But if you do have a question that you would like for Kalpa to answer before we get to that, don't be afraid to ask it in the chat. And it's important, right? Because there's been so many things that have shifted. Kalpa, you just brought up the idea that there's been a number of things that have changed recently with layoffs. And the most important thing we can do is show up for one another as a human. So Kalpa, if you don't mind, in the few minutes we have left, so how would you describe your life and your business and your key relationships today?
Transformed, right? Completely, right? And I think each day I am shining the light on that little child, right? Every single day. So, and I have one of my in fact, as you were asking about values and things, it brought me so much joy when I finally lean into that my purpose is to help sexually abused women and children claim their power, use their voice, live with joy, and create a kinder world, right? If one thing that I want to change is, right now I'm 43, but average age at which people start sharing their trauma with others is 52. Can you imagine like living half your life? And sometimes people don't even share. So that's the one statistic societally I'm looking to change, because 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys are abused before they are 18. I want you to sit on that statistic for a second. These could be your children. This could be a spouse. This could be a colleague, right? And this is not specific to sexual abuse, but if I shared the story on the ACEs, there's so many. So I feel like complete in alignment. Like today is my grandmother's like 1-year death anniversary as well. And I think just remember, you are your ancestors' biggest dreams, right? So, and I certainly feel that way. And so I am blessed, I have worked on taking intentional action, right? And sometimes it's easy to just ignore things and, until shit hits the fan, basically, right? And in my case, it did, like with full force. So today I'm in complete alignment, like in my life, like no conversation is, any hard conversations, we got to have it and have a plan essentially, right? So I'm loving the journey, my coaching, speaking, and consulting journey, right? On building trust and creating equitable workplaces.
Yeah, it matters. Hey, Christine, would you mind sharing the results from the 4th polling question? Okay, so we can see for the folks who are calling in today and participating, about 50% of you said that for the most part, most of the time, you do feel that you work in a high trust organization, which is fantastic. And there's a roughly equal distribution amongst the rest of you for that. But it warms my heart, Kalpa, that at least 50% of the folks on the call say most of the time they're in that place. And I know we just have a couple of minutes here, but I did want to point out that you recently moved from Phoenix, Arizona to Austin, Texas. And that was a big part of your transformation and change and being able to share your story a little bit more openly. But I also remember you saying something to the effect of the feelings that you had in childhood, you're clearly in basically the opposite place, right? So you've come to this place of realizing that your personal identity is not your business identity, right? You're in a much, much deeper level of awareness of yourself and where you choose to distribute time. Is that fair?
Yeah, and that's such a good reminder, Michael. So remember, like, you're not your job, your title, the money you make, anything, right? You're more than that. And for me, like, it's so important even now as an entrepreneur, as a business leader, to, I take that hat off like in the evening or during the day multiple times, that because there are ups and downs even in business, right? And then you start attaching your self-worth to anything you have in life, like any material assets or your title, and for me, really the true measure in my life is the quality of my relationships, right? Do I feel like I can have any conversations? Do I feel supported, right? Whether it's with my husband, whether it's with my mom, whether it's with my son, because these are the three like places like where we get most triggered and most response, right? So it's complete opposite, Michael, of what it was at least a few years ago. And I would say my healing journey honestly started like on my path to motherhood, because the things were simply not working and I needed to heal my body.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to be respectful of time. So Christine, if you would launch the 5th polling question so we can get that up for folks, and then I'll do a bit of a summary. And this is for the good folks at FEI and the various chapters that have sponsored and helped to facilitate our event. So I know we have a fair percentage of folks that are not FEI members, and we hope you would consider joining us in that way. But if you happen to be an FEI member, would you like to see more virtual events offered? And you can see there's 4 options on your screen. So yes, by my chapter only. Second option is yes, by my chapter and other chapters, so joint events. Or if you're an FEI member, yes, by other chapters only. Or if you don't want more virtual events, just click no, and that's okay. So go ahead and take 30 seconds or so to answer that. And don't forget, we're gonna stay on the line to do some more Q&A in chat and network with Kalpa if you feel so called to do that. But what I wanted to point out, Kalpa, a couple of things is that I think I was the first person really that you spoke about in 2018 with regards to the sexual abuse and the number of things that it did to affect you. And then there was a number of things that transpired in the years that followed, but you also went back to India recently, I think it was last year, and confronted the abusers, right? You had built up so much courage and so much strength, and your mental models had changed so much that you were able to actually confront them. Do you want to talk just for a second about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I went through a lot of coaching, Michael. So even after our journey, at least in some ways, kind of, I won't say ended, like our coaching relationship at the time ended, but I invested further, in this path and with some of the spiritual teachers as well as more on the breath work as well. And I got to a point where this was not like that incident didn't hold any power on me, right? So when I had those conversations with the 2 people who were alive, I could sense the discomfort and fear in them. And 2 of them have sometimes we think our abusers has had it easy. That's not true. They've also had equally different life, difficult life. So in both the cases, in my case, like they had no power over me. And when I had the conversation, they simply said they've changed. And and it's not for everybody, right? You don't always have to have a conversation, but sometimes we also make up stories about like so much live in fear, and which may not be true. When I had the conversation, it allowed me to display that they had no power over me, and they are struggling in their own way, which is for them to heal in their own life. And I believe my having that conversation opened that door.
Yeah, good for you. Now, before I pass it back to Jeremy to bring us to a close, just want to reiterate real quick. In those early years, Kalpa was given this false persona by her family and kind of asked to behave that way. For many years, right, she lived that false persona basically to her detriment. And so then all of a sudden, she and I met in 2018, and she chose to shed that false persona and to come up with new mental models that were actually aligned with her mission or her core values. And now what you're listening to her is she's very, very empowered, right? She's literally confronting the abuser. She's literally paying the lessons forward and talking about very, very vulnerable topics that she might not have been able to 20 years ago. So I just really want to honor you, Kalpa, in that way, and that the work that you've done is very, very inspiring, because it's enormously difficult to go through what it is that you did and to come out the other side to now be a safe haven for others who have navigated something similar. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Michael. And I would simply say, it's been an honor to work with you. And I'm so blessed that, so many things went well in my life. The reason that I'm here today, right? So when I share this, part of it was like also thinking about my legacy, right? Like from my son's perspective, like, as I shared earlier the statistics, and I had brainstormed this many years ago in a piece in a journal, right? And I had written, if I got like 100, men and women basically or some executives who are in powerful role, if they have gone through, trauma, to share the story, slowly that story, will amplify to many, and maybe we will show some examples to children that they don't need to feel scared and stay silent. Because, if we ask children, like, why do you not share? I mean, most of the times they know that's why they don't share. So I am on the mission to start to help others share their story and heal, so that hopefully we have some of those, 10 years from now, some things change, right?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. May I pass the baton back to Jeremy for any type of closure,
Thank you.
or Parvinder?
Yeah,
I'll
thank-
take-
Go ahead,
Um,
Parv, go ahead.
Thank you, everybody, and we appreciate having the representation from across the country, especially the sponsoring chapters, Orange County and Silicon Valley, and of course Sacramento. And we met during lunchtime. Thank you for all that food for thought, Michael and Kalpa. You really fed our souls, and hopefully we can pass that on to everybody else. And in our workplaces, in our families, in our communities, and so on.